If we're able to sacrifice some bits of the future and some ethics and morals, this military would defeat the rebels and the militia easily. First of all the military has to do is secure the general utilities. I'm talking power plants, water purification systems, grid controls, all of it. Everything that we need on a single day, they will take control of. If they can't take control of it, they're going to destroy it. This is going to cause mass panic and havoc. Thieves and looters are going to appear, and they're going to take out a lot of people and a lot of things. The TV and the internet are going to be blasting propaganda 24/7. We see how Russia does it, and the U.S. government will do it even better, meaning that even all the rebels won't be getting along. Telecom systems otherwise are unusable. There's no more internet. There's no phone, no TV, which means organizing is going to be hard, and people are going to be ruthless. And at the same time, the military is going to be bombing major cities with cruise missiles, bombers, everything. They're going to reduce them to ashes. And that's not even necessary because they could easily just make us starve first. And if that isn't enough for us to wave the white flag, they're just going to bomb everything else they can. And total war, the military wins hands down, no contest. Manpower isn't an issue. Densely populated areas are a death sentence, as the majority of the U.S. populations live in densely populated areas. It may take some time, but as winter comes, we will eventually die. In a black and white perspective, the military may seem like it would win the war easily, but honestly, it just isn't that simple. The soldiers, airmen, Marines, all of the seamen who make up the military come from the same communities and the same backgrounds as those who would be fighting against. This means that unless the cause for which you're fighting for was so bad that it's universally rejected, there will be instances of soldiers disobeying orders, desertion, and even blue-on-blue attacks. It's important to remember that the military is made up of people who have families, they have friends and neighbors. They will not blindly follow orders to harm their own communities. This means that a war would be so unsustainable, and even the military would eventually become ineffective, unless, again, that the cause was so bad that they were so wholeheartedly against one another, but this would never happen. In addition to this, the media and popular support would plummet, and even if a small or specific target like Ruby Rouge or Wacko were brought up, emotions would still run deep for the population. Now imagine a few statewide rebellions where there's more of a mix of population between targets and those acting against targets. Media and popular support would plummet. In conclusion, the military may seem like it would win a war on paper, but it's just not that simple. Popular support, media relations, logistics, everything. There's so many factors here. And it's important to remember that the military is, again, made up of our neighbors, our families, our brothers. It is too hard to separate our species from our jobs. This scenario reminds me of the Vietnam War. Numerically superior side, not as well equipped, but fighting with the home field advantage. The U.S. destroyed them. The VC and NVA suffered horrendous casualties, while the U.S. suffered relatively light losses. The difference here is that now the military also has a home field advantage, and they can't retreat. Unlike most guerrilla warfare-style battles, the guerrillas can't just force the invader out, because it isn't an invader. But this isn't the U.S. in the Middle East, Soviets in Afghanistan, or the British in the colonies. This is the military's home turf. Their soil just as much as it is the militias. They can't just get tired of the fighting and leave. The key thing here is air power. Complete, utter aerial domination is in the military's hands. And since the question is concerning total open warfare and there's no distinction between civilians and the enemy, the Air Force can do total open warfare. Carpet bombing, napalm, everything. It'd be Vietnam 10 times over. Many not killed would be too demoralized and give up the fight. Here's another thing. You're talking in particular, not so much about open war. Your scenario seems to be more of a resistance movement rather than an all-out war. You're just talking about a fraction of the U.S. population rebelling. And you're right. 1% of the U.S. population outnumbers the U.S. Army drastically. The thing to consider, though, if we're just talking about some citizens joining the militia, how many would just join the military instead? Because without a doubt, there would be plenty of people who would hate the militia for starting the war, making life suck, whatever reasons. So if 1% of the population joins the rebels, are the other 99% just going to stick around? What if 2% joins the military? Suddenly, the military outnumber the militia, and they're better armed, and they also have a home field advantage. In your scenario, the only advantage the militia has over the military is numbers. The militia has veterans. Well, so does the military. Lots of them probably lots of still serving officers too. Home field advantage? Military has that too. It's the same country. The only advantage the militia has is numbers, which is heavily negated by the military's overwhelming firepower and air power. In an all-out war, citizens would defeat the army eventually through just pure numbers. They wouldn't win, of course, but by the time the dust is settled, all the major cities will be ruins, most of the administration will be gone, and huge swathes of the population will be dead. The country would be ruined. Let's say that the US military is self-sufficient in terms of supplies at least. Otherwise, they'd run out of supplies way too long before the fight would be over, and that's not even fun. So let's just assume that they're going to be self-sufficient. Now, exclude all the useless civilians. Not all of those are too old, too sick, too young. You get it. Everybody who can't fight. Still, that's a massive army, well over 100 million people. The military's biggest advantage is, of course, air power. Militias armed with homemade explosives, stolen military hardware, and guns for the civilian market won't do crack beep against helicopter gunships, airstrikes, and bombing runs. We'd be useless against them. I imagine that if they could secure a small strategic location, the military could hold off for a long while and devastate the civilians with airstrikes and carpet bombing runs from B-52s. All those NSA programs will pay off in spades as the government gains an incredible advantage in intelligence. Doubtlessly, it will have large numbers of professional government-trained spies hard at work too. The biggest thing to consider is the sheer might of their unrestrained U.S. Army. If all the civilians are their enemy and the rules are total war, they will unleash a terrifying amount of firepower that the people will be defenseless against. The only reason I give it to the people is because of the sheer numbers, and the army will undoubtedly get demoralized by continually destroying their own brothers. In the long haul, the American people will beat the military, but no one wins. All the cities are ruins. There's no more government. There's no schools. There's no nothing. The U.S. will turn into a godforsaken wasteland for decades to come. Okay, so I've been thinking about this a lot. I'm a veteran of the U.S. Army Infantry, and I have a pretty good understanding of Army tactics and all that. Here's my take. The American people would win in a war against the military. Let's break it down. Sure, people might say that America has a population of 314 million, but do you really expect every single person to fight? Think about all of the infants, elderly, disabled, the pregnant women, and all the people who just faint at the sight of blood. If we're being realistic, only a small percentage of the population would actually fight. But even if only 1% of the American population fought, that would still be 3.14 million people. And that's a pretty conservative estimate. I bet that the vast majority of this 1% would be veterans, hunters, gun enthusiasts, and so on. They'd be the cream of the crop, and they could be just as well as armed as the military in just a few days. I know from personal experience that a lot of veterans have weapons in their home, and there are gun stores all over the country that would open their doors to the militia. There are even Army Reserve units in towns that have vehicles, ammo, supplies, and heavy weapons like M24 OBs and MK19s. I bet the people who would raid those places within hours of the conflict starting. And even if they couldn't hold the reserve units, they would still be able to inflict damage and steal supplies. But the military would still outgun the militia. However, the militia would use guerrilla tactics and melt into the shadows. A lot of militia members would have served in Vietnam or in other small conflicts, and they would be familiar with the guerrilla warfare. They would also know the ins and outs of military operations and would strike at critical places to inflict maximum damage. They could even organize a highly effective psych warfare campaign, since they would know which buttons to push to lower morale. Sure, the military could try to root out the militia by executing families on live TV, but I think that would probably only backfire. More people would join the militia than would surrender to save their families, and the military would know there's no hope if they incite the other 90% of the American population that are not currently active fighters. Basically, even if only 1% of the US population fought 100% of the military, I just don't think the military could win. The militia would be too familiar with the military's tactics and would use guerrilla warfare to their advantage. And let's not forget that the American people are still breeding another generation of people who can fight. So it would become a matter of, can the US military kill enough civilians to force a surrender before the civilians kill enough military members? If the war drags out for an extended amount of time, the US military will eventually run out of people, while the American people won't.